This talk is part of a series presented by the TechAide AI4Good conference and hackathon. Our goal with this virtual event is to highlight technological innovation driven by AI and directed towards beneficial areas such as health, the environment, accessibility, and human rights. Importantly, we also aim at raising money for TechAide, a nonprofit dedicated to fighting poverty and social exclusion. And this is where you can help. Please consider donating by clicking the corresponding link in the description section of this video. Any amount will be greatly appreciated. Also, if you are watching this before November 12, 2020, consider registering to our event for a chance to ask questions and interact with our great speakers. This event would not have been possible without the help of our sponsors such as DeepMind, Ubisoft, Ivado, and Dell Technologies. We thank them for their generous support, and please visit our website for our full list of sponsors and partners. Finally, I'd like to give a special shout out to one of our sponsors. For those who don't know yet, Ubisoft La Forge is a collaborative space created by my colleague Yves Jacqui. At Ubisoft Montreal, they bring together experts from their studio and experts from the academic sector to accelerate R&D through prototyping. Through this process, they want to complement academic learnings while testing the potential benefits and technological innovations in virtual worlds, fill the gap between theory and practice. I invite you to visit their website, laforge.ubisoft.com, where you will find articles from their researchers and videos showing their prototypes. And with that, I'll leave you to enjoy our featured presentation.
Hello, my name is Yoshua Bengio, and today I would like to share with you some thoughts about public good, and in particular about incentives for public goods. My thinking starts by the work I've been doing around AI4Good in the last few years, and both on the side of what we can do with AI that's positive for society, as well as what can go wrong and how it could be misused. As AI becomes more and more powerful, these questions become more and more pressing. And my question today is about the current economic system, the current incentive systems in our economies, and what's their role in this issue, where they lead us, and how we might change the rules of the game to tilt behavior in a direction that's going to be better for society in general. So I don't need to tell you that AI has huge beneficial potential in many areas, but it can also be misused. And in the hands of many people, greed is leading to decisions that can hurt society, as we all know. We're destroying our environment, and we are killing people in a way now and in future generations because of what? That's what I'm trying to understand. So I'll talk about the problem of public good in general, but really this applies to many areas of our world. I'm interested in climate change, the decisions that are taken that are going to affect our health. If I have time, I'll tell you about antibiotics, for example, and how many economic actors are acting in a way that maximizes their profit, but could really hurt all of us, and already has hurt us, and it's getting worse. So one way to think about this as a machine learning researcher is to think of it as an alignment problem. So in AI research, there's a question of how should we align the behavior of AI systems with human values and public good? How do we program computers so that they behave in a way that's good for us? In a way, the same question needs to be asked about corporate behavior. How do we align corporate behavior with human values and public good? And governments are trying to do that with laws and regulations. But unfortunately, in spite of these laws and regulations, we find corporations managing to act legally or close to legally and still hurting society, whether it's in the environment, whether it's social harm, whether it's political harm, or medical harm. To help us understand what is going on, I'm going to propose today to take a geometric view, to think of individuals or corporations as economic agents that are imperfectly trying to optimize a form of self-interest, which in the case of many corporations boils down to the discounted future profit that they will make. And then they're trying to maximize that. So that points in a particular direction in the space of all policies. They're currently at a particular point in that space and are trying to change their behavior towards making more profit. Now, that's a gradient. That's a direction in space, which might be different in different places. There is another gradient which I'd like us to think about, and that is the gradient of public good. In other words, how could an economic agent change their behavior to be more beneficial to society, to hurt society less? So that's the blue arrow here, the gradient of public good. Now, let's consider this notion of self-interest a little bit more carefully. Individuals are not just motivated by money. In fact, a lot of our motivations are not reducible to money right now. We want to do something good for our community. We want to feel good about ourselves. We want to help others around us, their health. We want to make sure our future grandchildren will have a nice life and environment to live in. And so the actual behavior of people, their actual self-interest, is a combination of different factors that include public good and include maybe securing their future and thinking that this can happen by maximizing the amount of money we can accumulate. But unfortunately, for reasons that are complicated, when you look at corporations, especially as they get larger, that sum of two vectors between the money gradient and the public good gradient becomes tilted. Even though the individuals in the corporation are usually good people, the pressure from investors to maximize profit, the fact that investors are detached from the day-to-day operation of the corporation, the fact that individuals in the corporation are, in a sense, in a social structure which makes them align their inner impulse towards the interest of the corporation, leads to corporations doing more of profit maximization and less of taking care of the public good. And this, I think, in a very abstract way, is at the source of the problem that we're talking about. And as AI becomes more powerful, as these companies become more powerful, this becomes more of a problem. In addition, companies, as they become more powerful, can influence the laws, right? This is lobbying. And so now they're kind of carving the limits on their behavior to maximize more profit. The stock price of a corporation, in a way, summarizes that self-interest that a corporation is trying to maximize. Investors are coaxing the executive of the company to maximize the stock price because this is their reward. So what governments are trying to do is create laws, regulations, taxation, incentives to try to steer the behavior of corporations closer to public good. And in particular, governments want to avoid public harm. So they might fine corporations whose behavior is harming society. And going back to the geometry that I was talking about, that simply means that the angle between those two gradient vectors is greater than 90 degrees, or the dot product of the two vectors is less than 0. And we can calculate based on that angle how much harm they're doing. If we could quantify public good, of course, which is a big topic of my presentation today. Now, there's something interesting about what's going on here if we think about these two vectors, like the self-interest vector of corporations and the public good vector. let's see what is the effect of laws that are constraints. A lot of laws are constraints. You're allowed to do this, you're not allowed to do that. And so corporations will change their behavior to increase profits until they hit one of those constraints. Then they can't increase anymore in the same direction. They have to move along the constraint. So that's the little dotted blue vector that we are seeing. It's a projection of their self-interest gradient on the linear constraint, at least locally linear constraint of the law. So that can work. But now you see the corporation is going to continue pushing in that direction. And another thing that's important is that that means that mature corporations are behaving always on the border of legality, right? Because otherwise they could make more money. So that's a problem, especially because the laws are imperfect. And so we get immoral behavior where companies are just barely legal, maybe respecting the letter of the law, but not the spirit of it. Another problem is geometrical. In fact, the very reason why I started thinking about this in geometric terms, that in the very high dimensional space of the policies that corporations can follow, like all of the things it could do, it's very difficult to cover all of the possible directions they could go into that could be harmful. In other words, you might need an exponential number of laws that are constraints in order to make sure that corporations are not going to harm the public. And in fact, they generally find ways to do so. And there's so many stories of loopholes, right? Not even due to lobbying or influence on policy, but even just because it's hard to find a sufficiently constraining set of constraints that prevent corporations from going against the public good. So a big message of my presentation today is it's not enough to have these legal constraints. Governments, in order to influence corporations in the right direction, need to use incentives. So incentives, geometrically speaking, are very different from constraints. They basically get added to the self-interest. And so you get what you see in the figure, where the behavior change is now going to be the sum of the self-interest gradient and the incentive gradient. And you can easily show that that incentive gradient needs to be aligned with the public good gradient. And when we do that, we can take a corporation which was harming the public into a corporation which is actually helping public good. So in other words, fiscal policy is super important. But of course, a crucial problem here is how are we going to define those incentives? How are we going to quantify public good? Before I go there, one important aspect of the incentive gradient is that it should be smooth and continuous valued, right? At any moment, it should pull the corporation towards better behavior. So for example, cap and trade in carbon markets is not a good idea, at least so long as there are companies that operate below the cap, because there's no incentive for them to improve unless they're hitting the cap. So that's something to keep in mind when we design fiscal policy, that it should be not too discrete. Another example of what doesn't work is having these big fines when a company is doing something really bad. These are going to be rare events, so discrete events, and that means that the signal that the companies are getting is not as smooth as if every little step that they do towards harming the public would be penalized. Now, public good is not one clear quantity that we can easily describe. In fact, it's much more natural to think about many public goods. So you can think about, in the medical domain, dailies like disability adjusted life years. You can think about things like how many children are dying of hunger, whether people, employees, and customers are satisfied, how many crimes there are, how many tons of carbons you're emitting. All of these things, biodiversity counts, are different ways of trying to evaluate different aspects of public good. The good news is there are already lots of people whose work is to try to define such metrics and why do they make sense and what maybe their limitations, and invent new metrics that are aligned with, in democracy, what we collectively think should be defined as public good. Now, there's a problem. In addition to having to come up with such metrics, there's a problem of short-term versus long-term rewards. So one thing is, how many lives is my current action going to cost the public if I create some pollution, for example? And the other thing is how many lives this will destroy over the coming decades. These are two different things. And the way that we want to, say, fine a company that is creating such pollution should be based on the sum of all the consequences for the future of their current action. So in the same way that the stock price is actually an estimate of long-term discounted profit, we want to think about pricing public goods in a way that incorporates all of that long-term effect that can be estimated even by humans. I mean, investors right now use their brain and knowledge to estimate these kind of long-term value. What if instead of using their brain and their knowledge to figure out how much profit a corporation will make in the future, what if they were using that same capacity to estimate, say, how many deaths they're going to cause or how many lives they're going to save, so that we can quantify public good and then optimize it. So there's some interesting analogies, in fact, between the relationship between investors and entrepreneurs on one hand, and the actors and critics in reinforcement learning. So what the investors are doing is like estimating a value function. They're trying to compute the present value of future rewards, discounted. And then the entrepreneurs are like the actors and the actor-critic approaches, and they're essentially trying to maximize that value. So I think one of the components that we need in order to change society towards less harm and better good is financial markets that quantify a number of public goods. In fact, we already have some of these markets, not enough, but for example, we have markets for carbon emissions. But I guess one issue with the carbon emissions is the way that they're priced right now is clearly insufficient. And that's due to the current mood about the current beliefs about climate change. It's almost sure that in 10, 20, or 30 years, governments will think that we underestimated the damage that a ton of carbon emitted today will cause in the future. So if we could use the natural behavior of investors and traders to estimate that future public harm or future public good and price it. Basically, they're going to bet on this instrument, this financial instrument, like a future. And they might sell it as a form of insurance against the future views and certainty about the future views of governments down the road. So what we need for this is that government anchor these instruments in like dollar amounts by providing fines or rewards in proportion to the price. That society gives to these goods. So in a way, what we want is to make sure that governments today try to tax behavior of corporations for the long-term consequences of their actions. And so we want financial instruments that estimate that. And one scheme, well, if we could do that, then it would be really great for public good projects, which currently have a hard time financing themselves, getting capital for long-term endeavors. Right now, there's a lot of nonprofit organizations or even academics who have projects. They can get grants, but these are like short-term. It's hard for them to have sustainable long-term plans because they can't attract investors and capital for longer-term projects. But if we had such public good markets, then investors, knowing that governments will give back money in the future for the good that is currently done through the actions of that organization, would be willing to put money for the long term. Now, actually, let me go back to the financial instruments. So one thing I think it is possible is to create these financial instruments as a kind of ticket that an authorized dealer, like a bank, can buy and sell. And this ticket corresponds to, for example, in the case of carbon, the right to pollute, say, 1 ton of carbon in 2020. And that right is going to be priced by society now and in the future. The societies of the future may revise their views on what should be the price of that ticket. So those agents, those trading agents, the way they would operate is they would sell that right to, say, a company that is polluting 1 ton of carbon in 2020. The company would then pay a fixed price, which is the current estimate on the market of that ticket. But then the authorized dealer that just got a big lump of money for that right would then have to give back money to governments in the future years, starting with probably a big amount today, but potentially also large amounts in the future if future governments revise their position about the true, correct value of that public good. Okay, so let me now tell you about a particular public good which I care a lot about as a researcher, and that is knowledge. So I haven't heard people talk about this, but really I have the impression that there's a market failure around knowledge. So knowledge is not valued in dollars very easily right now in our society. And as a result, especially the public good value of knowledge, and as a result, what you have are corporations that are working shrouded in secrecy. And that leads to global inefficiencies. Why? Because corporations don't have access to the knowledge being discovered by other corporations, or at least very little of it. Compare that with academics who have access to all of the work that's been done by other academics. And so we don't need to reinvent the wheel in academia, although sometimes we do, because finding that knowledge, that's another issue. So we can build on other people's work. We can see a piece of code written by another group, and we can see, oh, if we could change that line, we could do better. and then we can increase the value of that public good by making that change. Whereas companies might have to do the same kinds of experiments over and over again across different companies, for example, in the pharma industry, because the competitive nature of the markets prevent them from sharing that information at the risk of losing out to their competitors. So how do we fix this? I think looking at how it works in academia teaches us a lot. Maybe there's a way to take some of those lessons and reward the sharing of information in private corporation so that the knowledge as a public good is valued properly. So we would need to reward sharing of knowledge. And for this to work, we also need to reward the proper assignment of credit, right? So academics get brownies if they write papers, but they also get brownies or punished if in their papers they don't assign credit properly. And you need both of these in order to somehow distribute. In the case of academics, it's academic recognition. But in the case of companies, maybe we need to find a way to price that. And in fact, governments do already a bit of that by funding a lot of the R&D that is happening in companies. Let me tell you about one example that illustrates some of the things I'm talking about. And it's the example of antibiotics. This is something few people are aware of, but there was a really nice report a few years ago from the UK government, the O'Neill report, which talks about currently around 700,000 deaths per year because we don't have the right antibiotics and because the pathogens are mutating. That's the problem, right? So as we discover a new antibiotic and then use it over and over, that gives a chance to these bacteria to mutate and become resistant to them. And that's a big problem because antibiotics are used everywhere in our healthcare system, for example, for operations. So they estimate that by 2050, if we don't find a way to create a lot more antibiotics, it's going to cost the world's economy $100 trillion US. So you might ask, if there's so much money at stake, why is it that companies are not going after that? It's because it's not profitable. And it's not profitable because an antibiotic, to be useful in a way, should be used very sparingly. Because the more you use an antibiotic, the more chances you give to bacteria to mutate, to be resistant to it. So what you want is to give like first line antibiotics, and then if it doesn't work, second line and so on. And you get to these more rare cases where you have to use the newer antibiotics. So it's not profitable, but it's going to cost huge amounts of money to society. 10 million deaths per year by 2050. That's a lot. That's more than COVID-19. Probably we're not out of it. So what we need is corporations somehow getting incentives from governments to work on these kinds of things, corporations or academics. So that's something I'm thinking about. The last point I want to bring up is that there is a game theoretical issue, not just in the markets, but also in the relationship between countries. So this, if you think about, again, climate change and the price of carbon, if different countries put a different price on carbon, then companies that operate across countries can arbitrage that difference and make money basically thanks to those differences. For example, they can build stuff in a country where they're not going to be fined for the carbon and then sell it in countries where carbon is priced. You can imagine all kinds of solutions, but the really only stable solution is to come up with international treaties by which different countries agree on the global shared price of public goods. The problem is there's a tragedy of the commons problem, and then you can have countries that just decide to let others do the effort. So I think the only way out of this is to tie commerce, international commerce, with these treaties, because in that case, the incentive for countries to act in a way that's better for the whole planet is going to be clear, right? So in summary, this whole notion of incentives is something that comes up at many levels if we want to change our societies towards survival, if not betterment, because as we develop powerful tools like AI, there's really a danger that they be misused more and more. And even without AI, we see that corporations are acting often in a way that ends up to be very dangerous for all of us. So on that, thank you very much. And I really like to get feedback on these ideas that are very new for me, and I think important to think about in the future. Thanks.
This talk is part of a series that aims to collect money for TechAide, a nonprofit dedicated to fight poverty and social exclusion. I urge you to click on the link in the video to donate and support them in fighting poverty and social exclusion. Thank you.